Foundations of Western Political Thought. Module 8, History as Logic, Hegel. In 1806, the philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was living in Jena, a university town in the German state of Thuringia. He was finishing his first major work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, when Napoleon's army arrived. On the 13th of October, the day before the Battle of Jena, Hegel saw Napoleon riding through the town on horseback. He wrote to a friend, "I saw the emperor, this world soul, riding out of the city on reconnaissance." It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual who, concentrated here at a single point, astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it. World soul. That phrase tells you something about Hegel. For him, Napoleon was not merely a general or a conqueror. He was history itself, taking visible form, the embodiment of forces that had been building for centuries, now concentrated in a single individual who would reshape Europe. This is how Hegel thought. History was not a catalogue of accidents, not one thing after another, not sound and fury signifying nothing. History had a logic, a direction, a meaning. It was the unfolding of what Hegel called Geist, usually translated as spirit or mind, working itself out through time, through nations, through individuals who often did not understand the forces moving through them. This idea that history has a direction, that it is going somewhere, that later stages are in some sense higher or more developed than earlier ones, would prove enormously influential. It would shape Marx, who inverted it. It would shape progressive thought, which secularized it. It would shape the 20th century's grand ideological conflicts. And it remains often unacknowledged in the background of contemporary debates about progress, development, and the right side of history. Understanding Hegel is difficult, but it is necessary if we are to understand what came after him. The path ahead is steep, but necessary. We begin with the dialectic, that strange logic of contradiction and resolution that drives history forward. The master-slave encounter where apparent victory becomes defeat. Geist, spirit, or mind, working itself out through time, through peoples, through individuals who do not grasp the forces moving through them. The philosophy of right and its troubling claim that the state is the march of God in the world. Then the split that followed his death, Right Hegelians defending the actual, Left Hegelians demanding transformation, and one young follower named Marx, who would stand the whole system on its head. Finally, the owl of Minerva, spreading its wings only at dusk, the sobering thought that philosophy understands an age only as it ends. The man and his context. Hegel was born in Stuttgart in 1770, the same year as Beethoven, 1 year after Napoleon. He lived through the French Revolution, the Terror, the Napoleonic Wars, and the conservative restoration that followed. These were not abstract events for him. They were the raw material of his philosophy. He studied theology at Tübingen, where his roommates included the future poet Friedrich Hölderlin and the future philosopher Friedrich Schelling. All three were captivated by the revolution in its early stages. They planted a liberty tree together, or so the story goes. The young Hegel was an enthusiast for revolutionary ideas. But the terror sobered him, as it sobered Burke. Unlike Burke, however, Hegel did not conclude that the revolution was a mistake. He concluded that it was necessary, but incomplete, a stage in a larger process that would eventually reconcile freedom with order, individual will with rational institutions. After university, Hegel worked as a private tutor, then as a newspaper editor, then as a school headmaster. His academic career began late. He was 36 when he published The Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807. He was 48 when he finally secured a professorship at Berlin, where he became the most famous philosopher in Germany. He died of cholera in 1831 at the height of his influence. His major works include The Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807, The Science of Logic, 1812 to 1816, The Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, 1817, and The Philosophy of Right, 1820. His lectures on the philosophy of history and lectures on the history of philosophy were published posthumously from student notes. Hegel's method is called dialectic. The word is Greek. It originally meant conversation or debate. For Hegel, it describes the process by which thought and reality develops through contradiction and resolution. The popular version goes like this: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You start with a position, thesis. It generates its opposite, antithesis. The conflict between them is resolved in a higher unity, synthesis, which then becomes the thesis for a new cycle. Hegel himself rarely used these exact terms. They come more from his predecessor, Johann Gottlieb Fichte. But the underlying logic is genuinely Hegelian. Ideas and institutions contain internal tensions. These tensions drive development. The development does not simply negate what came before, but preserves it at a higher level, what Hegel called Aufhebung, usually translated as sublation, meaning simultaneously to cancel, to preserve, and to elevate. Consider an example. The ancient world, in Hegel's account, achieved a kind of harmony between the individual and the community. The Greek citizen did not experience his duties to the polis as external constraints. He identified with them. This was beautiful, but limited. It depended on excluding slaves, women, and foreigners from full humanity. Christianity introduced a new principle, the infinite worth of the individual soul, regardless of social position. This was an advance, but it created a new tension. The individual now stood apart from society, with an inner life that belonged to God, alone. The harmony was broken. Medieval Christendom tried to resolve this by subordinating secular life to spiritual authority, but this created new contradictions between church and state, faith and reason, the city of God and the city of man. The Reformation pushed further. Luther insisted that the individual conscience, guided by Scripture, was the ultimate authority. This was liberating, but also fragmenting. If every person is their own interpreter, on what basis can society achieve unity? The Enlightenment tried to answer reason. Universal reason, accessible to all, could provide the common ground that tradition and authority no longer supplied. But the French Revolution showed where pure reason led when it tried to remake society from scratch, to the terror, to the worship of abstract principles that devoured their own children. Each stage, in Hegel's telling, preserves something from what came before while transcending its limitations. The process is not random. It has a logic, and it is moving somewhere. The master and the slave. One of the most famous passages in the Phenomenology of Spirit describes the dialectic of lordship and bondage, usually called the master-slave dialectic. It is not primarily about literal slavery, though it has implications for that. It is about the development of self-consciousness, how human beings come to recognize themselves as free. The story goes like this. Two self-consciousnesses encounter each other. Each wants recognition from the other, wants to be acknowledged as a free being, not merely a thing, but both cannot have recognition on equal terms, because each initially sees the other as a threat to their own freedom. They fight. One is willing to risk death for recognition. The other, at the crucial moment, backs down, chooses life over honor. The one who risked death becomes the master. The one who chose life becomes the slave. At first, this looks like a victory for the master. He has recognition. He has leisure. He has another consciousness that affirms his superiority. The slave works. The master enjoys. But Hegel's analysis inverts this. The master's recognition is worthless. It comes from someone he does not respect. A mere slave he has won, but won nothing. His consciousness remains undeveloped, dependent on a relationship he despises. The slave, meanwhile, is transformed through labor. By working on the natural world, shaping it, making things, the slave discovers that he is not merely a thing himself. He sees his own consciousness reflected in what he has made. He develops discipline, skill, the ability to defer gratification. Through the very activity that marks his bondage, he achieves a kind of independence the master never finds. Through work, the bondsman becomes conscious of what he truly is. This is Hegel at his most counterintuitive. The apparent victor loses. The apparent loser wins, or at least develops. The relationship that looks like simple domination turns out to be more complicated. The master needs the slave more than the slave needs the master. Marx would seize on this. The proletariat, laboring while the bourgeoisie enjoys, would become the agent of historical transformation. The workers, through their very oppression, would develop the consciousness and the capacity to overthrow the system. Hegel's dialectic of recognition becomes Marx's dialectic of class struggle. But notice, Hegel is not saying that slavery is good or that oppression is justified by its educational effects. He is analyzing how self-consciousness develops and finding that the path runs through conflict, through labor, through relationships that are deeply unequal. History is not a story of the powerful simply winning. It is a story of reversals, of unexpected developments, of the cunning of reason working through apparent defeats. Geist and history. Where is it moving? Toward freedom. But freedom understood in a particular way. For Hegel, freedom is not simply the absence of external constraint. That is what he calls negative freedom, the freedom of the isolated individual to do as they please. Negative freedom is empty. It has no content. Pushed to its extreme, it becomes the freedom of the terror, the freedom to destroy everything that limits the individual will. True freedom, for Hegel, is rational self-determination. It means living according to principles you can recognize as your own, not arbitrary desires, but rational purposes that connect you to something larger than yourself. You are free when you understand and affirm the rational structure of the world you inhabit. This is why Hegel can say notoriously that the real is rational and the rational is real. He does not mean that everything that exists is justified. He means that reality has a rational structure, and that freedom consists in grasping and affirming that structure rather than rebelling against it blindly. Geist, spirit, or mind is Hegel's term for this rational structure as it unfolds through history. Geist is not a supernatural being directing events from outside. It is the logic of historical development itself, the process by which human consciousness comes to understand itself and its world. History, for Hegel, is the story of Geist becoming conscious of its own freedom. Different peoples, at different times, embody different stages of this development. The Oriental world knew that one is free, the despot. The Greek and Roman world knew that some are free, citizens, but not slaves. The Germanic Christian world came to know that all are free, though working out the implications took centuries and is perhaps not yet complete. This is what Hegel means when he says history is the progress of the consciousness of freedom. In the introduction to his lectures on the philosophy of history, he writes, "The history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. It is not a smooth ascent. It moves through contradiction, conflict, tragedy, but it moves the philosophy of right." Hegel's political philosophy is most fully developed in the Philosophy of Right, published in 1820. It is a dense and difficult work, but its structure reveals his method. He begins with abstract right, the realm of property and contract. Individuals have rights. They own things. They make agreements. This is the sphere of civil law, of external relations between persons who treat each other as abstract legal subjects. But abstract right is empty. It tells you that you have rights, but not what to do with them. For content, you must turn inward to morality. In the moral sphere, the individual conscience is sovereign. You act on principles. You can will as universal. This is Kant's territory. But morality, too, is incomplete. The individual conscience, left to itself, can generate endless scruples without ever achieving the good. It remains subjective, cut off from the social world where good actually gets done. Pure morality can become the beautiful soul that refuses to act because no action is pure enough. The resolution comes in ethical life, Sittlichkeit, the realm of concrete social institutions. Here the abstract individual finds content for their freedom through participation in family, civil society, and the state. The family is the immediate unity of love and trust. In the family, individuals are not calculating atoms pursuing self-interest. They belong to something larger than themselves. Civil society is the realm of economic activity, the system of needs where individuals pursue their particular interests through labor, exchange, and cooperation. Hegel draws on Adam Smith here. He recognizes that the market coordinates individual actions into a productive whole, but he also sees its limitations. The inequality it generates, the poverty it cannot eliminate, the way it reduces human relations to contracts. In a striking passage in the Philosophy of Right, Hegel observes that civil society, left to itself, produces both extremes of wealth and poverty. When the standard of living of a large mass of people falls below a certain subsistence level, the result is the creation of a rabble of paupers. This rabble loses the sense of right and wrong, the self-respect that comes from supporting oneself through work. Civil society creates the problem, but cannot solve it. This is one reason the state is necessary, not merely to protect property, but to address the contradictions that the market generates. Hegel was no socialist. He believed in private property and the market economy. But he saw that the market alone could not sustain a free society. Intermediate institutions, what he called corporations, meaning guilds, professional associations, civil groups, were needed to give individuals a sense of belonging between the family and the state. Without these, individuals become isolated atoms, and civil society becomes a war of all against all by other means. The state, for Hegel, is not merely a necessary evil or a night watchman protecting property. It is the actualization of rational freedom, the institution through which individuals can participate in purposes that are genuinely universal. The laws of a rational state are not external constraints on freedom. They are the conditions of freedom, the framework within which free action becomes possible. This is why Hegel can call the state the actuality of the ethical idea and the march of God in the world. He does not mean that every actual state deserves reverence. He means that the state, properly understood, is where human freedom achieves objective reality, where it becomes more than mere intention or wish. Hegel and authoritarianism. This language has made Hegel suspect. The march of God in the world. It sounds like worship of state power, like a philosophical justification for whatever government happens to exist. The charge was made early and has never entirely gone away. Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945, accused Hegel of being a source of modern totalitarianism, a prophet of the closed society, an enemy of individual freedom, a philosopher who provided the intellectual scaffolding for both fascism and communism. The charge is not baseless. Hegel's language can be intoxicating to those who want philosophical cover for state power. His dismissal of negative freedom, the mere freedom to do as you please, can sound like contempt for individual liberty. His insistence that true freedom is found in submission to rational institutions can be twisted into an argument that any institution calling itself rational deserves submission. And Hegel lived comfortably with the Prussian state of his day. He dedicated the philosophy of right to Frederick William III. He was careful not to challenge the authorities too directly. His philosophy seemed to sanctify the existing order, to say that what is what ought to be. But the charge is also unfair, or at least incomplete. Hegel was not an apologist for tyranny. He believed in constitutional monarchy, not absolutism. He supported the rule of law, the separation of powers, the institutions of civil society. He criticized states that failed to embody rational freedom. He simply thought the criticism should aim at reform, not revolution. His notorious claim that the real is rational is often misread. Hegel distinguished between what merely exists, existenz, and what is truly real, Wirklichkeit. Much that exists is accidental, contingent, irrational, and will pass away. Only what is rational in the deep sense, what embodies the logic of freedom, is truly real. The existing Prussian state fell short of this. Hegel knew it. The problem is that Hegel's philosophy can be used both ways. It can criticize existing institutions for failing to embody rational freedom, or it can sanctify existing institutions by declaring them rational. Which interpretation prevails depends on the interpreter and on what they want to do with the philosophy. This ambiguity would split Hegel's followers into two camps. The Left and Right Hegelians. After Hegel's death in 1831, his students and admirers divided. The division was partly political, partly theological, but it revealed a deep tension in the master's thought. The Right Hegelians, sometimes called the Old Hegelians, emphasized continuity and reconciliation. Hegel had shown that existing institutions, properly understood, embodied rational freedom. The task of philosophy was to comprehend this, to see the reason in what exists, to reconcile the individual with the actual world. This reading was conservative, compatible with throne and altar, supportive of the Prussian establishment. The Left Hegelians, the young Hegelians, emphasized critique and transformation. Hegel had shown that history moves through contradiction, that what exists contains the seeds of its own negation, that the rational is not yet fully actual. The task of philosophy was not to reconcile, but to criticize, to identify the contradictions in existing institutions and push toward their resolution. This reading was radical, subversive, aimed at transformation. The Left Hegelians included Ludwig Feuerbach, who argued that theology was really anthropology, that God was a projection of human attributes onto an imaginary being. Religion alienated humanity from itself. The critique of religion was the beginning of all critique. And they included Karl Marx, who would take Hegel's dialectic and transform it utterly. Marx agreed with Feuerbach that Hegel's idealism needed to be inverted, that the driving force of history was not spirit becoming conscious of itself, but material conditions, modes of production, class struggle. But he kept the dialectical method, the sense that history moves through contradiction toward resolution. Hegel is standing on his head, Marx wrote. He must be turned right side up again. What emerged from this inversion would shake the world. But it could not have emerged without Hegel, without the idea that history has a logic, that contradictions drive development, that what exists contains the seeds of what will replace it. The critique of liberalism. Hegel is often read as a conservative, and there is something to this. He criticized the social contract tradition from Hobbes through Rousseau. He thought they started from a false abstraction, the isolated individual in the state of nature, and could never recover genuine community from that starting point. For Hegel, there is no pre-social individual. We are always already embedded in families, communities, traditions, institutions. The question is not how individuals come to form society as if they had a choice, but how society enables individuals to become free. This is why Hegel rejected revolution as a political method. The terror showed what happens when you try to rebuild society from abstract principles. You destroy the concrete institutions in which freedom actually lives, and you are left with nothing but the will to destroy. The revolution eats itself. But Hegel was not simply a defender of the status quo. He criticized the Prussian state of his day for its bureaucratic rigidity, its exclusion of popular participation, its failure to develop the institutions of civil society. He was a reformer, not a reactionary. His position might be called, freedom requires institutions, but institutions must be rational. Tradition has value because it embodies accumulated wisdom, but tradition can also embody accumulated injustice. The task is not to abolish institutions, but to reform them, to bring them into alignment with the rational freedom they are meant to serve. This is a more nuanced position than either pure conservatism or pure progressivism. It does not assume that change is always good. It does not assume that tradition is always right. It asks in each case whether the institution in question serves rational freedom or obstructs it. The Owl of Minerva. Hegel is famous for saying, in the preface to the Philosophy of Right, that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. The owl of Minerva is the symbol of wisdom. Hegel means that philosophy can only understand an epoch as it is ending, after the living reality has taken shape, when we can finally see what it was. When philosophy paints its grey in grey, a shape of life has grown old. By philosophy's grey in grey, it cannot be rejuvenated, but only understood. This is a statement of remarkable humility or remarkable pessimism, depending on how you read it. Philosophy does not direct history. It does not tell the world what it ought to be. It comes too late for that. It can only comprehend what has already happened. This cuts against the revolutionary use of ideas. If philosophy arrives only at dusk, it cannot provide the blueprint for a new dawn. The revolutionaries who think they can redesign society according to rational principles are suffering from a delusion. They do not understand that reason grasps reality only in retrospect. And yet, And here is the tension. Hegel also believed that history has a direction, that later stages are in some sense higher than earlier ones, that freedom is progressively realized through time. How can he hold both positions? How can he say that philosophy comes too late to guide action, while also saying that history is going somewhere and that somewhere is better? This tension runs through Hegel's work and through all his successors. It is the tension between the backward-looking wisdom that understands and the forward-looking hope that transforms. Hegel tried to hold them together. His followers would split them apart. The world historical individuals. Hegel has a striking doctrine about great individuals in history, figures like Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon. He calls them world historical individuals. These are people who seem to act from personal ambition, pursuing their own glory or satisfaction. But through them, something larger is accomplished. They are, as Hegel puts it, the agents of the world spirit. They do not fully understand what they are doing. They think they are serving themselves, but history uses them for its own purposes. Such individuals have no consciousness of the idea as such. They are practical and political men, but at the same time, they are thinking men with insight into what is needed and timely. This is the cunning of reason, history's way of achieving its ends through the passions and interests of individuals who have no notion of the larger pattern they serve. There is something both flattering and deflating in this view. The great individual matters. Napoleon really did reshape Europe, but he matters as an instrument, not as a creator. The forces working through him were not his invention. He was, in a sense, history's tool. This doctrine has troubling implications. If world historical individuals serve history's purposes, regardless of their intentions, then the moral assessment of their actions becomes complicated. Hegel acknowledges that these figures trample on much that is innocent. The litany of private virtues, modesty, humility, philanthropy, and forbearance must not be raised against them. They operate on a different scale, serving different ends. This can sound like an apology for tyranny. It has been read that way. But Hegel's point is not that we should celebrate cruelty. It is that history is tragic, that progress, if there is progress, comes at terrible cost, and that the individuals through whom it moves are not saints, but driven men pursuing their own vision. Whether Hegel was right. Was Hegel right? Does history have a logic, a direction, a meaning? The question is harder than it looks. On one hand, there does seem to be a pattern, or at least a trajectory. The abolition of slavery, the expansion of legal equality, the recognition of individual rights, these have spread unevenly and incompletely across much of the world. Institutions that seemed eternal have fallen. Ideas that seemed utopian have become common sense. On the other hand, the 20th century offered powerful counter-evidence. The same Europe that Hegel saw as the culmination of historical development produced 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the Gulag, and the atomic bomb. Progress, if it exists, is not guaranteed. History can go backward as well as forward. The owl of Minerva sometimes watches civilizations die. And there is a deeper problem. If we are inside history, how can we know its direction? Hegel thought he stood at a privileged moment, the point where spirit had finally become conscious of itself. But every age thinks it is the culmination. The Victorians were sure that liberal civilization was the final answer. The Marxists were sure that communism was inevitable. Both were wrong. Perhaps the pattern we see in history is the pattern we impose. We select the evidence that confirms our narrative and ignore what does not fit. We tell stories of progress because we want progress. progress, not because history has a plot. Burke would say, the claim to know history's direction is itself a rationalist delusion, a grand theory masquerading as wisdom, blind to the complexity of actual life. There is also a conservative critique worth considering. Burke would say that Hegel's system, however sophisticated, still falls prey to the rationalist temptation, the belief that we can comprehend the whole from our limited vantage point. History may have patterns, but they are visible only in retrospect, and even then imperfectly. The claim to understand the direction of history is itself a form of hubris, an attempt to know what cannot be known. And the pragmatist might add, what difference does it make? Whether history has a direction or not, we still face choices. We still must act in uncertainty. The grand narrative, even if true, does not tell us what to do this morning. It may even distract us from the particular, the local, the immediate, where most of life is actually lived. This does not mean that thinking about history is pointless, but it should make us humble. The grand narratives, Hegel's, Marx's, the liberal story of inevitable democratization, have all been disappointing. What remains is the harder work of understanding particular situations, particular possibilities, particular dangers, without the comfort of knowing that history is on our side. How to recognize Hegel today? When someone says that a change was inevitable, or that we should be on the right side of history, that is Hegel's ghost speaking. The assumption is that history has a direction and that we can know it. When someone argues that apparent opposites will eventually be reconciled in a higher unity, that conflict is necessary for progress, that contradictions drive development, they are using dialectical language, whether they know it or not. When someone claims that an institution which seems oppressive actually serves freedom, properly understood, that the state is more than a necessary evil, that objective structures can be more rational than individual preferences, that is Hegelian thinking. When someone distinguishes between negative freedom, freedom from constraint, and positive freedom, freedom to achieve rational purposes, and argues that the latter is more important, they are in Hegel's territory, though the distinction was developed further by later thinkers like Isaiah Berlin. And when someone says that we can only understand the past in retrospect, that the meaning of events becomes clear only after they have happened, that philosophy comes too late to change the world. Appraisers, they are echoing Hegel's owl of Minerva. These ideas are not necessarily wrong, but they are not neutral either. The belief that history has a direction tends to license impatience with those who seem to obstruct it. The belief that freedom is properly understood only through rational institutions can justify ignoring what individuals actually want. The cunning of reason can excuse the cruelties of world historical individuals. Hegel himself was more careful than many of his followers, but the tools he forged have been used for purposes he might not have endorsed. Pause and consider. Before we move on, let me leave you with a question. Hegel claimed that history is the progress of the consciousness of freedom, that human beings have become progressively more aware of their own freedom and have built institutions that embody this awareness. And is this true? Consider the 20th century after Hegel produced totalitarian states that denied freedom more systematically than any ancient despotism. It produced technologies of surveillance and control that would have been unimaginable to earlier tyrants. It produced ideologies, some claiming descent from Hegel himself, that sacrificed millions of individuals for the sake of historical necessity. And yet, Slavery has been abolished almost everywhere. Legal equality, regardless of race, sex, or religion, is now at least the official norm in most of the world. The idea that government requires the consent of the governed has spread far beyond its European origins. Things that were unthinkable have become thinkable, and some have become real. So is history. Progress. Is freedom advancing? Or are we simply telling ourselves a story, selecting the evidence that flatters us? Hegel would say, we cannot know the answer until the epoch is over. The owl flies at dusk. We are still in daylight, or perhaps in the long afternoon, and we cannot yet see the shape of our age. Perhaps that is the most honest answer. We do not know where history is going. We only know where it has been, and even that imperfectly. The grand narratives may be illusions, or they may be truths we are not yet in a position to confirm. What we can do is act with whatever wisdom and whatever humility we can muster in circumstances we did not choose and cannot fully understand. That is the human condition. Hegel understood it. Whether his system captured it is another question. Next, we turn to Marx, who took Hegel's dialectic, stood it on its head, and used it to announce a revolution that would end history altogether. End of Module 8.